And recording.
Hi, good morning. We're here from City Hall. Can you hear us and see us?
We can.
See you.
Thank you very much. If you want to start.
Can you hear me?
Hi, Supervisor. Yes, we can hear you. And Chair Krakoff, yes, we will start housekeeping comments.
Good morning, everyone.
Thank you
Hi,
for
Larry.
participating in today's meeting. Please do not connect to Zoom or teleconference while in the room, and please silence all devices. Click on the globe at the bottom of your screen to select either English or Spanish. Public comment will be taken after each item. If you are in the auditorium and wish to comment, please use the iPads located in the lobby. For meetings in other locations, please complete a blue speaker card and provide it to a South Coast AQMD employee. Speakers may be limited to a total of 3 minutes or less for all agenda items, and times may be shortened to ensure all speakers can be heard. A countdown timer will be displayed on the screen for each public comment. More time will be allotted for Spanish translation that is not simultaneous. For questions or issues on public comment, please call the public advisor at 909-396-3247. That's 909-396-3247. Please adhere to the speaker time limit and treat others with courtesy, civility, and respect. Failure to do so can result in your mic being muted or you being removed from the meeting. Be aware that this meeting is being recorded. By participating, you are authorizing recording of audio and visual content presented during the live event and consent to subsequent use of the recording in the public domain by South Coast AQMD.
Do we have any Spanish today?
No, there will not
Very
be a
good.
Spanish translation today.
Very good. Thank you so much, everyone. So I'll go ahead. Wayne, is that okay?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone, to the May 17th, 2024 meeting of the Hybrid Mobile Source Committee of the South Coast Air Quality Management District. I'm here in Los Angeles City Hall, being hosted by Council Member Rahman, who is also here, and her staff, Jack. So we have an agenda in front of us, colleagues, with 7 items today. Let's start with the roll call, please.
Mayor Pro Tem McAllen. Here. Supervisor Mitchell. Supervisor Perez.
Here.
Councilmember Rahman.
Here.
Councilmember Rodriguez. And Chair Krakoff.
I'm here. Okay, welcome everyone, and good to see all of you. So we have one informational item with a presentation today. Everything else is written reports or other standing matters. So unless there's an objection, we can dive into informational item 1, 2023 ozone and PM 2.5 summary. Staff will provide a summary of ozone and PM 2.5 levels measured in 2023 and discuss overall trends and progress towards attainment of federal air quality standards. We have Scott Epstein today. I can't see in the auditorium there. Hi, how are you?
Correct.
Great. So we'll turn it over to Planning and Rules Manager Scott Epstein on item 1.
Thanks so much. Good morning, everyone. So I have what I think is a pretty interesting presentation, but I do kind of live for this stuff. So presentation is split into two parts. So first, we're going to talk about ozone, how it's formed, and health effects. Look at ozone trends and our 2023 levels, and then talk about some regulatory implications for the ozone standards. And then we'll shift over to PM 2.5, once again, talk about formation and health effects, go through the recent trends and 2023 levels, regulatory implications, and then I have an update on our Check Before You Burn program. Okay, here we go. Okay, so just a little bit of background on how ozone forms. So ozone is a secondary pollutant, meaning that it's formed in the atmosphere from the reaction of volatile organic compounds and oxides of nitrogen in the presence of sunlight. And these reactions are super complex. There's hundreds of different chemical reactions in the mechanism. But really the take home from this is ozone formation doesn't only depend on the concentration of NOx and VOCs, but also the ratio of NOx to VOC. And it turns out that in our region, NOx is much more important for ozone reduction than VOCs. So just a quick summary of the health effects of ozone. So the health effects are mainly respiratory in nature. So things like aggravation of different types of lung diseases like COPD, asthma, coughing, bronchitis. It's also children are especially sensitive to ozone. So we do see increased school absences on days with high ozone, and then also increased hospitalizations and ER visits on high ozone days. Okay, so here's a spoiler alert. So I'm going to summarize the ozone section and then show you all the data we have kind of supporting these points. So first, ozone levels have declined very significantly in the past several decades, but they're still unacceptably high and we still violate clean air standards. The levels that we saw in 2023 are fairly similar to what we've seen over the past decade. Unfortunately, we were unable to meet the 1997 8-hour ozone standard by the attainment deadline of 2023. Things are a bit rosier in the Coachella Valley. We had the same deadline for this 97 8-hour ozone standard by 2023. We did not meet it. However, since the 2023 data was clean and below the standard, we're pursuing a 1-year extension of that deadline. Okay, so now diving into the presentation. So here's a summary of the factors that influence ozone levels. So first on your left, you see NOx and VOC emissions from both mobile and stationary sources, and then also natural sources such as wildfires or vegetation. Meteorology is also really important for influencing these ozone levels. So mixing and ventilation, so how well we mix pollution up into the atmosphere and then also horizontally out of our region. Season is important. As I mentioned, sunlight is a key ingredient to smog formation. So we tend to see higher ozone levels when sunlight is stronger, kind of in the summer. And then temperature also plays a role. So higher temperatures accelerate the reactions that form ozone, and they also lead to more VOC evaporation, which is one of the key ingredients. And just based on looking at this, you can really see why the South Coast Air Basin is sort of the perfect place to form high levels of ozone. So we have a lot of emissions. We have really kind of relatively calm meteorology. We get this inversion layer. We have a lot of sunlight, and it gets warm in the summer. Okay, so we have these metrics that are called design values. So these are statistical metrics that we use to compare to the national ambient air quality standards. And what we do is we have this really comprehensive monitoring network all throughout our region, monitoring a whole wide variety of pollutants. And then at each of those stations, we take the data and we calculate a design value and then compare that to the standard. And I'll show a little bit about how these are calculated. And then the monitoring station that has the highest design value is what we call the design site, and we need to attain the standard everywhere. So at the highest, at the most polluted site. Okay, so there are two types of ozone standards. So there's an 8-hour standard and there's a 1-hour standard. So the 8-hour standard actually has 3 different substandards. But the way this is calculated is we look at the 4th highest 8-hour daily value each year and then average that over a 3-year period. And that gets us the design value. And that must be less than or equal to the applicable 8-hour standard. The 1 hour standard is a bit simpler. This is an older standard. It's actually based on the number of exceedances. So you're allowed on average 1 exceedance per year in a 3-year period at each station. Okay, so we know that air pollution emissions can ultimately lead to exposure and health effects. But for the purposes of this slide, I'm kind of separating emissions into emissions that are within our control and emissions that are outside our control, such as wildfires. So for emissions within our control, we have a control strategy with rules and incentive programs to help reduce those emissions. And then kind of the remaining emissions, we help mitigate public exposure to them with our exposure reduction programs, such as we have this real-time air quality index map. It's available on our app. We do forecasting. We issue air quality advisories during poor air quality. We do air quality alerts through the National Weather Service, and we do a lot of media outreach. The air quality standards are really designed to help inform this control strategy and reduce exposure from this upper route. However, we can't apply a control strategy to emissions that are outside our control. So there's this US EPA exceptional events rule that helps us address these events. So we still care about these events. We do a lot of exposure reduction on the public notification side, but there's just not really anything we can do from the regulatory side. So the exceptional events rule allows us to remove these events when we calculate attainment of the standard. So just to kind of sum that up, so exceptional events exist because we can't control them, and control measures are developed to meet our air quality standards. So when we want to compare our data to the air quality standards, it doesn't make sense to also include days that are out of our control. There's a very rigorous and onerous requirements by US EPA for demonstrating exceptional events. And then they have to be concurred by EPA, but the event needs to meet 3 main criteria. So one is that the event needs to clearly cause an exceedance. It needs to not be reasonably controllable or preventable. And it either can be a natural event or an event caused by human activity that's unlikely to occur. And here's some examples of these types of events below. So now that I gave you that background, now let's look at some data. So this shows our progress in attaining the ozone standards in the South Coast Air Basin. And if you notice on the plot, there are 3 ozone standards kind of highlighted with dashed gray lines, the 1 hour standard from 1979, and then 2 of our 3 8-hour standards, 80 ppb and 70 ppb. And each of those have different attainment years shown on the right. So if we first look at the 1 hour data, which is shown in the red, you can see we're trying to get to that highest gray line. And we did not attain that standard by the 2022 attainment year, and we're still a bit above that 1 hour standard. The news is similar for the 8-hour standard. The 80 ppb standard has a 2023 attainment year, and you can see we're still above that dash line. You also notice from this.
If you look at the 2022 data, if I can ask a question.
Sure.
Where did we end up for the 2022 attainment year in terms of the PPB?
I don't have the exact number offhand, but it's pretty significantly above the 125 ppb standard.
All right, so we're above we're somewhere in the looks like 130 range, and we've got to eventually get down to 70.
So that's for 1 hour ozone. So we have to get to actually 124.9.
Oh no, I'm talking about the 2015 8-hour standard. What I'm trying to get at is
Sure.
how much percent do we have to reduce from where we are to meet the 2037 attainment year requirement?
Okay. It's a pretty significant percentage. The numbers, I don't know the exact number offhand, but it's definitely very challenging.
I've heard something like we have to reduce our carrying capacity by 67%. Is that it, or is it less than that? I'm looking at this chart.
Yeah, so it's a bit hard to get that. That's the right number, but it's a bit hard to get that number from this chart because this chart is showing the actual concentrations that we measure, which isn't directly proportional to the actual emissions. But yes, from an emission reduction perspective, we do need to reduce the carrying capacity by that amount.
Chair Krakoff, so I think one thing to highlight is that we do see that existing regulations are going to continue to drive NOx emission reductions, and so that is definitely going to help. But even with those existing regulations, we do know that substantial additional emission reductions are going to be needed. So the point that you raised about a 67% reduction in emissions, you can't quite see this on the graph because of all the chemistry that Scott described before. But yes, we do need substantial emission reductions by 2037.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, real quick, this is Supervisor Perez. Shouldn't we at least have some sort of ballpark figure?
Yes, the figure that Chair Krakoff mentioned is correct. So that's 67% by 2037. It's different for different standards, but that is correct.
The questions are going to continue to come moving forward, right? And so we need to make sure that we are able to present at least some sort of number to the community in hopes that they realize how difficult this is and everyone do their part. So I just think it's important that we definitely provide a number, something that people can understand.
Thank you, Supervisor. The challenge we have is that we have multiple standards that we're actually trying to attain. And Scott was talking about the original standard, the 1979 1-hour ozone. And you can see the dashed lines that talk about the 2008, I think the 2015 standards and the relative attainment year. It's very difficult to think of just one number when you have so many different standards. And in fact, EPA is beginning another review process to maybe revise the existing ozone standard. So we have the information for the specific standards and what those are. And when Ian described what we're doing with regards to existing regulations and where we anticipate to be, we have highlighted what that gap is, and that gap is significant. And that's in part where we look at where the majority of those emissions are coming from, and that's why we were talking about federal sources so strongly, because we keep controlling those sources under which we have control, but there's still a sizable portion that is attributed to those planes, trains, ships, and trucks. So we're going to continue to work with the federal government on those aspects.
Wayne,
Carlos?
just,
Hi.
Chair, to that last point, the modeling projections on emissions reductions relative to the levels that we need to attain, do we have modeling that would reflect where we would be if, to your last point, the planes, trains, et cetera, that are under the federal regulatory scope, if those were reduced at even a modest level? I'm just trying to understand that the implication and the correlation of how close we would be, if not in attainment, if we all were doing our part. So is there modeling and projections to that point? I'm just trying to understand if we would essentially be at attainment, if not for that issue.
Yes, and I'll let Ian and Scott answer that.
Yes, that's a great question. We do, of course, have a very robust modeling analysis that we put into all of our air quality management plans. And so the most recent analysis that was comprehensive on ozone was our 2022 Air Quality Management Plan. And what we can say definitively is that for the 2015 ozone standard, we could eliminate all emissions in South Coast AQMD under our jurisdiction, and the remaining emissions from aircraft and locomotives and ships would exceed our carrying capacity. And there's a variety of different ways to show this, but we have very quantitatively looked at this analysis, and I think that's why we're pushing so hard to try to get those emission reductions from all agencies with jurisdiction.
Oh, so I understand that analogy, eliminating all on ours, but let's say, have we done an analysis to say if on the federal side they had 10% improvement or 15% improvement, how much would they need to be able to do on their side to impact these numbers and get us to attainment? Because it just seems to look at another analogy with the Olympics coming up. If we were doing a 4x100 relay, the first 3 legs, AQMD is sprinting, and then the last leg, the federal government is at a walk. And so we need them to, how do we get them to, to a jog? If they were jogging, for instance, and there was a reduction, would we be being able to win the race here, so to speak, to continue the sports analogy? Like, again, just trying to understand and
Right.
how much more do we need them to do? It seems that it would just be a reasonable, modest amount to really get us into attainment, assuming that we're going to be continuing to sprint and do everything on our end.
Let me just add, and then Ian and Scott can add some additional thoughts. So we talk about the different federal sources: planes, trains, trucks, ships. And part of the challenge is you have a significant contribution by those sources. So for instance, you could make up a lot of emission reductions if you were able to target the ships. Or you could do the same thing on locomotives. And so there's a certain combination, right, that will get us to where we need to be. And a lot just depends on how much we can get out of a certain issue. The example that I'll give has to do with EPA's recent effort on heavy-duty trucks. We were arguing for a very stringent standard of 0.02 that would have actually had a relative significant impact on our region. But where EPA came out, it really didn't impact us as much as we would have hoped in the time frame that we would have hoped. So that's an example where there was a large opportunity. They didn't get where we had hoped they had gotten. It was a small incremental gain. And so that's going to be, I think, the same process we see on how they address locomotives. Will they be able to come up with a tier 5 standard? Are they going to do an in-use standard? And how much can we get on that? I think, though, to your point, Board Member Rodriguez, is can we provide them with specific targets and say, this is what we would need from you? And it's a combination of those targets across the board. I think that's what you're getting at, right?
Yeah, so exactly. So we need you to get 5%, 3%, whatever they might be, at least to be able to empirically have a target that's scientifically driven, that we've done some modeling so that they have something to aim for, and we can point out specifically we continue to do everything on our end, but we need this. We needed to get to a jog here, because right now the walk is not helping the team. Thank you.
Yes, I think I can. We actually have this analysis as part of the Air Quality Management Plan, and also carved as at the same time, the state SIP strategy. And in there's a single table that I think is pretty handy that shows individual measures and how much emission reductions we need from every individual measure, including on federal sources. And so this would be Table 7 and Appendix, or in the state SIP strategy, and Appendix 4B of the Air Quality Management Plan. And there it lays out specifically for locomotives, for aircraft, for ships, for off-road equipment, et cetera, what are those emission reductions that we need? And then we also see, the relative contribution from all of the state measures as well. And so we have that analysis that's there, and we can provide that as well to the committee members.
Mr. Chair?
Right.
I'd like to, I'm looking at some data from the Glendora, Santa Clarita, Banning, and Redlands sites, fourth highest ozone readings between 2005 and 2023. There seems to me, looking at that aggregate of that data, that from 2005 through 2015, there was a slow decline in the ozone reading for about 10 years. And then in 2015, there seems to be a slow rise in the ozone level readings. Do you have an explanation for that? Since NOx has been coming down?
Yeah, so the chemistry actually suggests that we will see sort of a flatlining, which we are seeing in ozone concentrations as we reduce NOx. And then once we sort of get over this hump, we'll continue to see downward ozone levels. That's borne out in modeling. It's also borne out if you go into the Coachella Valley, which is less NOx rich, which is actually on the next slide, you'll see that we are at that point where we're over the hump and we see those significant year-to-year ozone decreases.
But looking at this chart, even at the end there, 22, it seems to be rising. And in 23 data that I have here, it is rising significantly.
Yeah. I think, there's some impact to the chemistry. There's also impacts in sort of the spatial distribution of emissions is likely changing throughout the basin as development patterns change as well.
And if I could add, I think one of the things we also see is that meteorology plays a big impact. And so as we have hotter years, that definitely can increase ozone concentrations. But I think one of the things we'll see in this presentation is that while South Coast, we are flatlining a little bit and what you're describing, and that certain sites are like we're seeing a shifting of where ozone concentrations are coming down faster or flatlining. But what we see is when we look in totality, Coachella continues to come down, fine particulate matter keeps coming down, and that is a result of this continued NOx strategy. And we're seeing that impact that it continues to come down as we expect on all these other pollutants. We're just in this plateau right now that's very frustrating for South Coast. But we see this strategy works for all these other pollutants, and we're anticipating that's going to keep coming down in South Coast as well.
Thank you.
Keep going with the presentation. Obviously, with the proposed disapproval from EPA of our contingency measure plan, this is at the front of mind of the board members and our constituents, and making sure that we communicate the scope of our problem, what we're trying to address it, how we distill the data into common sense, easy to understand calculations is really important. But obviously you can tell Scott and Ian and Wayne from the board members' comments that this proposed disapproval of our ozone plan from EPA and what it means and what it means moving forward certainly has all the board members' attention.
Okay, so I have a similar plot now for the Coachella Valley up on the screen. So things look quite a bit rosier in the Coachella Valley. So if you see the red line is the second highest 1 hour value each year, and comparing that to that upper dash line, which is the 1 hour standard, you can see that we're well below the 1 hour standard in the Coachella Valley. That happened around 2004, mid 2000s. 8 hour ozone, so we are approaching this 80 ppb standard that had a 2023 attainment year. It turns out that when we look at our 3-year design value, we did not meet that standard by 2023, but our single year value is below the standard. And that has some regulatory implications that I'll talk about on this slide. So there were some wildfires on July 14th and 15th in 2023, mainly the Rabbit, Raichi, and Highland Fire. And we're fairly certain these were exceptional events and led to 2 very high ozone values in the Coachella Valley. We're in the process of finalizing an exceptional event demonstration for these events after about 6 months of work. And if this gets approved by EPA, we're pursuing a 1-year extension of our attainment year because we're able to show clean data in 2023. So just to remind you that the design values are based on 3-year averages, and you need to attain with that 3-year average. But there is this provision that if your last year is below the standard, your single year is below the standard, and you meet other requirements, you can get a 1-year extension in the attainment date. We think it's very favorable that we'll meet the standard in 2024 because we've seen this decreasing year-over-year trend out in the Coachella Valley and very low values in both 2022 and 2023.
Could I, excuse me, could I ask, what is the mechanism that increases the ozone with wildfires?
So wildfires emit NOx and VOCs, and you can load that up and form more ozone from that.
Okay, and also you get PM 2.5, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So that has usually wildfires play a bigger role for PM 2.5 exceptional events. But however, you can get, in certain circumstances, you can get increased ozone if the chemistry is right and there's enough emissions. Yeah.
Let me just add, if I could, that I think ultimately our major concern out here, and Wayne and staff last week after the strategy session sat down with a few folks out here from CVAG, is really the dust issue that we face because of these storms that happen all of a sudden. And I think when it comes to the fires that we've had out here, we've done a pretty good job of creating a task force, different entities to try to deal with that, and that's been helping with ozone. But nonetheless, so I think our major issue still continues to be the dust, and obviously we're going to have that conversation in the future with folks out here and AQMD, which is a major concern because it seems like it's getting worse. But anyway, this is a long conversation to have on another issue.
Thanks. Okay, so we can also look at this ozone data in the context of air quality index. So we split the air quality index. Everybody's probably seen it: green, yellow, these traffic light colors. Orange, red, and purple are unhealthy for sensitive groups, unhealthy, and very unhealthy. So when we're in the orange or higher category, that means we're actually exceeding the federal air quality standards. And each of these bars represents the total height of the bar represents the number of days that we've exceeded the standard in a year. And then it's sort of split up based on how bad the ozone was kind of beyond that. And you can see that, relatively flat trend in 2023. It's a little bit lower than the number of exceedances in past years. But we do have a significant chunk of that bar that's driven by this red, unhealthy, and a little bit of very unhealthy. In the Coachella Valley, there are far fewer exceedances. Also, there are no very unhealthy days, and the unhealthy days are very rare. And then we can look at how these ozone exceedances occur kind of spatially. And you can see our highest ozone levels tend to occur in southwestern San Bernardino County, in our Redlands, San Bernardino, and Crestline monitoring stations. But a general rule of thumb is as you get further inland, ozone levels do go up. And then once you get out into the Coachella Valley, there's enough dilution and less emissions, so ozone levels go down there. Okay, so this is fairly complicated table. So this looks at the regulatory implications with the 4 ozone standards that are on the books for both the South Coast Air Basin and the Coachella Valley. And as the colors indicate, red is not great, green, we're in good shape, and yellow is sort of to be seen. So you see here that we weren't able to attain the 1 hour ozone standard by the 2022 attainment date in the South Coast. We also weren't able to attain the least stringent 8 hour standard by 2023 in the South Coast. We have plans for the other 8 hour ozone standards in the 2016 AQMP and 2022 AQMB. And then in the Coachella Valley, so we have attained the 1 hour ozone standard. For the 97 8 hour ozone standard, as I mentioned, we missed this 2023 deadline, but we're pursuing this 1 year extension because our 2023 data was clean. And then we have plans for the other attainment years.
Scott, for the, if you can go back to that slide. So, but again, just to be clear, the two boxes on the top right, the plans that we've submitted for attainment of the 75 and 70 ppb standards rely heavily on federal reductions for aircraft, ships, locomotives, and trucks. Correct?
That's correct, yes.
And depending on how much they do, that will determine whether it is possible for us to meet those standards.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. And again, just to summarize what I think we all heard from Mayor Rodriguez is, just a sort of a easy to understand slide as to how much do the feds have to do in order for us to, cross the finish line in that fourth leg of the relay. Is it even possible for them to get us across the finish line, and how fast, how much do they have to go? It'd be nice to really have a clear understanding of that, especially as we are in negotiations with them and asking them to help us get across the finish line. How much of an ask is it? My sense is it's enormous, but having that depicted graphically in a way that's easy to understand, I think, is where Mayor Rodriguez was going. Right, Carlos?
You said it quite well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so the regulatory implications of our failure to attain these ozone standards can include things such as non-attainment fees, contingency measures, and the requirement for a new attainment plan. So EPA is currently evaluating these consequences. They're required to publish them in the Federal Register within 6 months from our attainment date. So our attainment date, the 2023 attainment date, is actually mid-2024, so 6 months from mid-2024. Okay, so moving on to the second half of the presentation, looking at our PM 2.5 trends and summary. So PM 2.5 is fine particle pollution that's less than 2.5 microns in diameter. There's a diagram in the upper right part of this slide to just give you a sense of how small these particles are. They're microscopic, can't be seen with the naked eye. Human hair is 50 to 70 microns. This PM 2.5 is less than 2.5 microns. It's linked to a wide variety of both cardiovascular and respiratory health effects, such as things like heart attack, asthma attacks, lung cancer, premature death. These particles are really small. They can get deep into your lungs, get into your bloodstream very easily, and cause serious health issues. So there's also a lot of evidence suggesting link to other health effects related to the metabolic system, nervous system, cognitive effects, accelerated cognitive decline, reproductive effects, and developmental effects. Because of all these health effects, exposure to PM 2.5 actually drives the majority of the public health costs in our region due to air pollution. Okay, so spoiler alert again, here's kind of a summary of what I'm going to show you for PM 2.5. The news is much rosier than the ozone picture. So our 24-hour PM 2.5 levels do meet the federal standard of 35 micrograms in the last 3-year period. 2023 was the cleanest year on record when we look at annual design values, and the second lowest year on record for 24-hour design values. These are due to some factors which I'll talk about. We have a draft plan out to attain the annual 2012 standard, and will be brought to the board next month. And then in the Coachella Valley for PM 2.5, we continue to be well below both PM 2.5 standards. Okay, so a bit of background on how PM 2.5 forms. So whereas ozone is a secondary pollutant and is formed in the atmosphere, PM 2.5 can be emitted directly from combustion sources and can also be formed in the atmosphere. And that's from reactions of VOCs, come from a wide variety of sources, and atmospheric oxidants, and also reaction of NOx and SOx and ammonia. It turns out in our region, this secondary fraction is responsible for about 2/3 of the PM 2.5 mass. So there are many factors that influence PM 2.5 levels. A lot of them are similar to what we saw for ozone, but emissions of mobile and stationary sources, natural sources such as wildfires, other sources such as fireworks, mixing and ventilation play a key role in governing how much concentration we have in the atmosphere. Fog and humidity, we tend to see higher levels on more humid days. Sunlight, some of these secondary formation reactions actually depend on sunlight. And then storms are also important. So we all know after a rainy day, it tends to be really clean. That's because rain's really effective way of scrubbing the atmosphere. And also the increased convection and ventilation that happens when we get a storm blow through helps clean things out. Okay, so there are two forms of the PM 2.5 standard. So there's an annual standard. That calculation is pretty simple. It's really just an annual average over 3 years. There's this 12 microgram per cubic meter standard that was established in 2015. And there's a brand new 9 microgram per cubic meter standard that was just established this year. There's also a 24-hour standard, and the 24-hour standard is designed to look at the highest days each year. And this is based on the 98th percentile, so that roughly translates to about the 8th highest value each year. And that standard is 35 micrograms per cubic meter. So basically the 8th highest value each year, averaged over 3 years, that's how we calculate that design value. So we can look at our trends in annual PM 2.5. So these are annual design values. So the first thing that I want to draw your attention to is how much annual design values have decreased since monitoring began. So the first design value is 2001. Monitoring began in 1999. You can see more than a 50% decrease in annual design values. Second, you can see that we've met this 15 microgram standard a while ago. We're getting closer to the 12 microgram per cubic meter standard, but we're not quite there yet. And then this 9 microgram per cubic meter standard that's brand new will be challenging and require additional emission reductions to achieve. We can look at these design values spatially. So once again, unfortunately, southwestern San Bernardino County has the highest PM 2.5 levels in our region. Also, metropolitan LA has some pretty high values. And then we also have 2 monitors that are along freeways, our near road stations, and we tend to see a bit of an enhancement at those near road stations. Okay, so now we can look at the 24-hour standard. So this focuses on the highest days each year. And we have that 35 microgram per cubic meter line on the plot. And you can see that in 2020, we were kind of right at that standard. 2022, also right at that standard, and 2023, now we're below that standard.
Just a question, what do we think are the control measures that have led us into this good place?
Pretty much all of the above. It's a bit hard to point to any specific measure because there's so many different sources of PM 2.5, but yeah, we think everything contributes in some way. Sorry, that's a very unsatisfying answer.
Scott, if I could, I think one thing that we should note is Scott mentioned 2020, 2022, 2023, and you see that there's a little bump in 2021. And when we've looked at this in the past, we know there was a lot of port congestion right then. And so a lot of these same federal sources, there was a lot of extra emissions coming in right then. And we see that there is an increase in PM. So we know that it's another signal that we really need to address these sources.
Has it been the SCRs on on heavy-duty trucks to limit diesel exhaust? Can you give us any specific measures that you think have really helped here?
Yes, the SCRs that you're mentioning, that's a very good technology that's used in mobile applications as well as stationary applications that really reduces NOx. I think what we've also seen for direct PM control, that diesel particulate filters on mobile sources like trucks has also been a really good addition. We see a lot of that on off-road equipment as well. So I think with PM 2.5, it's this combination of direct PM control as well as NOx controls on both the mobile side and on the stationary side where we're seeing this real benefit. And we've seen some changes in fuels have helped in the past. But I think we're going to see that moving forward, the technologies that we're going to need to rely on is more of what I just mentioned on the SCRs and the particulate filters are pretty widely deployed at this point. There's still some more that can happen there, but we're really going to have to start transitioning to ultra low NOx technology and zero emission technology to achieve these next set of standards, because a lot of these controls have been put in place. For example, all trucks as of last year were required to have an SCR. And so now we need to go to the next stage of emission controls to continue getting reductions.
Okay, so we can also look at kind of when we tend to see exceedances. So with the exception of 4th and 5th of July, pretty much all our exceedances occur during the winter months. In 2023, January and February, we had no exceedances. And then October, November, December. October and November were clean. December, we had a few exceedances during the holiday period. But the point is that the 24-hour standard's based on the 98th percentile value, the 8th highest value. So we can have some exceedances and still meet the standard. Just a quick summary kind of showing how 2023 compares to the second lowest year on record. So 2023 has the lowest 98th percentile value, and that's, I'm sorry, the second lowest 98th percentile value. The first lowest was last year. And then in terms of annual average, we had the lowest annual average with the second lowest being last year. So why? So that's a tough question. I'm going to bring it back to this original schematic to kind of go through some of these factors. So on the emissions front, so we know emissions have decreased year to year, so that likely contributes to lower PM 2.5. We also had fewer wildfire events over the past couple years. 4th of July activity was pretty similar year to year. We did see a bit less mixing and ventilation when we look at the meteorological statistics, so that potentially led to some more PM 2.5. We also saw higher humidity on average over this past winter, which also leads to more PM 2.5. Sunlight was similar to previous years, and storms were beneficial in that we had more rainfall and more rainy and windy days. So kind of on average, all these factors contribute to PM 2.5, but likely the emission reductions and the storms were able to kind of overcome the negative implications of meteorology from mixing and fog and humidity. So we have a similar chart now looking at the PM 2.5 standards. It's a lot more green and yellow than the ozone chart, but shows that we have met the 24-hour standards in the South Coast Air Basin. And the Coachella Valley has always attained the 24-hour standard and the annual standard. We're evaluating whether we'll continue to attain with this new 9 microgram per cubic meter standard. That's still under evaluation, but we think it looks very favorable.
Or maybe others, do you know, just going back to that slide, when do we have to submit the plan for that new standard, the 9 microgram?
I believe that's 2026 that we're going to be developing that next plan. Yeah, we haven't been designated just yet. Right. Yeah, so we haven't been designated yet. We're expecting that designation, I think, next year. But then we'll have a year after that to develop our plan.
Councilmember Rahman just won re-election. She's very excited about being here in 2026 to draft that plan.
Okay, so in the last few minutes, I just want to give an update on our Check Before You Burn program. So as we know, wood burning is a significant source of PM 2.5 during the winter months in our region. We have Rule 445 that allows us to prohibit residential wood burning when we forecast poor air quality. So basically, if we forecast that the maximum PM 2.5 levels in the basin is going to exceed 29 micrograms per cubic meter, we can prohibit wood burning between November to February. There are some exemptions to this rule. So low-income households, communities that are above 3,000 feet in elevation, and houses that don't have natural gas are exempt. It also doesn't apply to the Coachella Valley. And there's a lot of variation year to year as to how many no-burn days we call. It's really dependent on the air quality and the meteorology. Kind of ranges anywhere between 5 and 35 days. So in order to make these no-burn decisions and for also exposure reduction, we issue a daily air quality forecast. We also do the forecast for ozone, PM10, NO2, and CO for 45 different areas. We're one of the few agencies in the country that also issues an hourly AQI forecast to help people plan their outdoor activities, and then a cleanest time of day product to help people to indicate when the best time is to do your outdoor activity. And this is available on the website and on the South Coast AQMD app. Okay, so how did things look in the last 2023-24 season? So this is the November to February period. So we had 8 no-burn days. This is similar to 10 no-burn days in the previous year. We did pretty well with our forecasting. So we were roughly 92% accurate in calling these no-burn days. So 112 out of 121 were called correctly. 3 of those days, we actually didn't quite exceed 29, but we got really close. 2 of those days that we did call no burn, we ended up still exceeding the 35 microgram per cubic meter standard. Those were during the holiday period. And then there was one exceedance that our forecast system wasn't able to capture.
Call those no burn days, going back to that slide, do we see a market difference in PM performance? People are responding to our no burn day advisories, and it's making a difference in our measurements?
It's really, really hard for us to feel that out of the data because, our forecast models are accurate usually around like 4 micrograms per cubic meter or so. And the impact of this no burn program is probably kind of within that amount. So we can't tell if we undershot our forecast because people weren't burning or because our forecast just was off by a couple micrograms. So it's really hard for us to know how effective it is from that side. If you know a way, let me know because we love to figure that out.
If I can just add to that. So Scott and his team do a really great job on our air quality forecast. I think it's probably leading in the nation on how good our accuracy is. So he's underplaying a little bit how good we are in this. But it is really difficult to tease this out. We can do modeling analyses to see, what is the impact. And I think that's one thing we're probably going to have to come back with. We're working on the PM plan right now that we're going to be coming back with this summer. And the Rule 445 Check Before You Burn program is going to be one of those control measures that we're going to have to look to revisit. And a lot of this is based on a modeling analysis. What we do know is that direct controls of PM 2.5 can have an effect to reduce PM 2.5 levels overall in the basin. So it is really hard to tease out, but this is where modeling can assist.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, and just to give you context, so for being accurate within 4 or 5 micrograms per cubic meter is really good. I mean, it seems like a lot, but that's better than most. So we're really proud of that. We're working hard to get that even better, but we're in a good place right now. And then also, just to wrap this up, so we do a lot of outreach for the Check Before You Burn program. So we want as many people as possible to know about this program. So outreach on the website, through our app. We issue air quality advisories every time there's a no burn day. They all get emailed, posted on our website, emailed to, we have tens of thousands of subscribers to airalerts.com. We have a collaboration with the National Weather Service to issue these through their channels, just like you'd get a severe thunderstorm warning. We do press releases, extensive media outreach, and then our Compliance and Enforcement Division responds to air quality complaints related to these and can actually issue violations. Okay, so here's my last slide here. So just an overall summary of the presentation. So we've seen ozone levels come down significantly over the long term, but they're still well above federal standards. And that really continues to be our biggest challenge, air quality challenge in the region as a whole, is meeting these ozone standards. PM 2.5 is looking really good for the past few years. So at least for 24-hour PM 2.5, we do meet the standard. Annual PM 2.5, we're not quite there yet, and there's definitely some more work to be done to attain this new annual PM 2.5 standard. So that's all I had, and can hand it over to Wayne.
Thanks, Dr. Epstein. I do want to note that as we look at the values, it's important to recognize the climate potential impacts. And I think, Mayor McCallum, you'll recall, I believe it was 2019 when the fourth National Climate Assessment came out. And we had people come out and they talked about the impacts of temperature, and particularly in the West, how it was going to be more difficult to reach those standards. And so I think as we continue in this journey, we have to look at the climate impacts on what we're doing and how that impacts it, in addition to all the other things that we're looking at. And I know that's one of the things that the team's working on. And I know Supervisor Perez had talked about really trying to develop and have an internationally renowned type conference that could look at these kind of issues. And I somewhat jokingly said, oh God, because I know how difficult it is to put something on of this magnitude. But I just wanted to assure Supervisor Perez and the board that these are things that we're thinking about, and we'll continue to provide the information to the governing board in terms of how all this information comes together, how we work with other organizations, states, local agencies, and the federal government to address these challenges. So thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. Unless there's other comments at this time, can we go to public comment and then we'll come back to the board to wrap it up?
So we have two public commenters thus far.
Okay, so let's open the queue now, please. And can you please close the queue in 30 seconds?
Yes, we can. The first speaker is Harvey Etter. Harvey? Harvey, you need to unmute. There you go.
Yes, good morning. Am I being heard?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. In reference to Mr. Kosiadi's questioning, where does all this come from? And to Dr. Scott's answer, from all this stuff from everywhere. What's wrong? It's been that way for half a century, and you've done nothing. We've come to you for most of that time. Okay? And we gave you the solar. We gave you what the Department of Energy is doing in Sunshot, and you ignored it. You never evaluated it, and that's lost time. We've lost the last 10, 15 years because of this cover-up. And I'm referencing last month's environmental law review from Harvard on litigating for murder, all right? And this case says that the murder is more than all murders ever committed, prosecuted in the history of the United States. Okay, this is very serious stuff, and this is the real. Now, we got to deal with it. By the way, contingency measures, especially on the back end, and we were pigeonholed into that by planning and Anita. clearly state it's not just transportation money, it's open to all federal money. All right? We'll talk more later. We gave you some notice of ex parte. We've had health problems and whatnot, and that we're going to be following up. We've been asked to put in comments that will be reviewed by Anita. All right, thanks. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. The queue is closed. And our next speaker is Mark Abramowitz. Mark.
Thank you, Wayne. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm Mark Abramowitz with Community Environmental Services. It's very exciting to see the amount of progress that we've had over the last several decades. However, the job, as you see, is daunting ahead of us. I'm really happy to hear some of the questions that you folks have been asking about what exactly do we need to do, where is our goal, and if staff could turn to slide 13. I wanted to first say that in terms of the implications of not meeting these standards, the staff focus is on the sanctions that are there. But the sanctions are really just a fallback in the Clean Air Act. And as for most laws, these kinds of things are not expected to kick in. So it's a little bit concerned that when the purpose of the rule is actually public health, that the focus and the implications is all around sanctions. And we do have state laws, and there are no deadlines for meeting those state laws, but the expectation is that there is going to be progress toward meeting those state standards. And so as a board, you need to think about the implications of getting toward meeting all of your requirements, not just the ones that will result in sanctions. And thank you. If you look at this slide here, you'll note that there's a 1 hour ozone standard, a shorter time period than the 8 hour, which means it's basically a more stringent standard. But the state standard is actually at 90 parts per billion, which, although is a higher number than the 8 hour federal standards, is in fact much more difficult to reach and a more stringent standard. So the job before you is actually going to be significantly higher. And so it's important that you keep an eye on where you actually have to go to protect public health. And that staff also continues to remind you of where you need to get to, as well as ensure that the route that you're taking will enable you to get towards that end goal of meeting public health standards. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And our final speaker is Moses Huerta. Moses.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Moses Huerta here, resident City of Paramount. Just wanted to first offer recognition to staff. I did attend the PM 2.5 meeting here locally, and it was a pleasure to meet everybody in person. It was informative, and I am grateful for this presentation as this advanced going forward. I appreciate the in-depth dialogue as well in this conversation as this process moves forward. And I asked staff to correct me if I'm wrong. I was pleasantly surprised and welcomed the information that as a community member who's also invested in a low-cost monitor that does read PM 2.5, that that data is contributing to the knowledge and the information as we progress this process. So I want to appreciate that information and look forward to have this plan move forward and look forward to a continued dialogue. Thank you for the opportunity. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Moses. Good to hear from you. All right, we'll take this back to the board members. Any final reflections or direction? Mayor Rodriguez, anyone else?
Let me just jump in very quickly and say thank you for the information, and obviously at our strategic planning session, we did talk about potentially a conference of sorts. Look, we don't need to start large, right? We can start small. We can start with what's in front of us and think that through and eventually grow potentially to something that could be international. But, you know, obviously we have to be realistic with our parameters and funding streams and staffing and things of that nature. So I'm just hoping that eventually we can get there, start thinking that through, and potentially maybe even get some grants for that. I just wanted to put my 2 cents to advocate for something of that sort.
Thank you, Supervisor. Anyone else?
Mr. Chair.
I'll just say, I think that's a great idea, and I'd also support the conference vision that Supervisor Perez highlighted, and also the chair had reiterated some of my comments with respect to, I believe it was, should be taken away as more a direction to bring back any refinement to the tables Ian had shared with respect to what's the gap needed on the federal side for us to meet our attainment as discussed earlier in the presentation. So it'd be great to have that clarified in a future meeting. Thank you.
Wayne or Ian, when does the ozone planning matter come back to this committee or to the board? In whatever form or for whatever standard?
Chair Krakoff, can we get back to you on that? I know we're working on the Coachella Valley one, but let me get back to you on the next date that we would come back to you.
And just when you do that, just try to give us a slide that clearly shows the gap and shows what we've assigned to the federal government, that gives us a sense of what the extent of the task that we've assigned to them is. Right, Carlos?
Yes, but with just the nuance of projection of how much would be needed from them. Is it the entirety of what their obligation is, or even just a proportion of that would get us to our collective attainment? I'm just trying to get that distinction down, or if it is the entirety of their obligation. Just trying to get that clarity. Thank you.
Yeah, I know that information certainly was presented in the AQMD last year. So just distilling that and maybe even just copying some of the slides from that, just so we still have it front of mind as we're engaging with the feds in connection with this proposed disapproval and any other ozone items that are coming to us in the short term to medium term. Anything else from the board members at this time?
Mr. Chair, if I might, we've been talking about temperature and its effects on all of this. Looking at the meteorology data from just looking at the average temperature in LA from 1949 to 1979, it was a cool period. And then from 80 to 98, it was a little warmer. And then from 99 to 2014, it was cooler. And obviously 2014 to now, it's a lot warmer. And I believe that is really attributed to the Pacific high that sort of oscillates back and forth. And we get cooler and hotter periods over the basin. So interesting facts.
Well, thank you, Mayor McCowan. How's the forecast for this weekend?
Well, my forecast would be just as good as anybody else's.
Thank you, Mayor. Anything else on this item for now, board members? Okay, we will then go forward with the rest of the agenda. The rest of the agenda, items 2 through 4 are receive and file reports. Anybody have any comments or want to pull anything there? Item 5, other business. Hearing none, we'll go to public comment. We'll do 2 minutes today, please. And whoever has remaining time Our council will monitor that. So we'll open this up for item 6, public comment for 2 minutes each, please. You can open the queue.
Thank you, Mr. Eder.
Hello, am I being heard?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. My name's Harvey Eder. I'm speaking for myself and for the Public Solar Power Coalition. First of all, on what I was saying before in reference to contingency measures, there are guidelines that talked about sanctions and federal money for transportation and other things being stopped. And there is a history of this, and that is basically the policy. That's my understanding. So I just wanted to correct that. Now, in this international meeting, I'll tell you, what's happening right now is something like 30% of new capacity in the world is solar. All right, we've taken over the market. The question is, who's going to own it and control it? 3 years ago, they said over 60% of the new stuff that was going in, it was solar and wind, primarily solar, but it was owned by the fossil fuel companies. Okay, we got to stop this. After what happened at COP28 with the Arabs and the oil companies, this stuff's got to be stopped. That's a big overview of what's happening in the Middle East and with our political economy and the inflation and the whole ball of wax. We never counted in.
Limit your comments to items within the jurisdiction of the Mobile Source Committee. Thank you.
Okay,
Harvey,
note.
30 seconds remaining.
This is responding adversely, talking truth to power. Enough said. We'll deal with it in court and the public opinion.
Thank you. We can move on.
We have a public commenter here in person at City Hall, Thomas Jelinich from the PMSA.
Thank you, Chair Krakow. Thank you, board members. This morning, I would just like to extend my thanks to the board, to AQMD staff for the fantastic retreat that they held last week. We learned a lot, I think, from the expert panel that AQMD staff put together. We have a lot of work to do in terms of continuing to support electrification, to support hydrogen deployment, and to support infrastructure in general. I think the focus on infrastructure in terms of reducing emissions from port-related sources will be extremely important. And I look forward to working with the agency and hopefully as well as CARB and federal partners to make that happen. And I think focus on infrastructure is the fastest and best way to get continued emission reductions from port-related sources. The collaborative effort has been successful for 15 years, and I firmly believe it will continue to be. Thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Jelinich. Seeing no other public comment, we will close that item. Our next Mobile Source Committee is Friday, June 21st. Is that right? Yeah, I guess so. We're going to have the rail ISR in theory on that mobile source agenda?
Yes.
Okay, so that's going to be an important one, everyone. And we'll see you then, Friday, June 21st at 9 a.m. is the next meeting. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend, everyone.
Take care.